first is that in this language of Japanese, which makes all these fine distinctions about body states, there is no word for the hot flash.
Born and raised in England, Margaret Lock did her graduate training in the University of California at Berkeley, and now is professor of medical anthropology at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. In her most recent book, Encounters with Aging, Dr. Lock takes a comparative look at women in Japan and North America during the years of middle age and menopause. Today, she talks about the book and the research that led up to it with anthropologist David W. Platt.
We have done, the biostatistician has done all sorts of fancy manipulations, careful double checkings and so on, and we're really now satisfied that we're dealing with something which is not a universal experience, and that there is a different biological activity going on. By the way, I'm uncomfortable with even using the word menopause when we're talking about the Japanese sample, because menopause is not the same thing as the Japanese experience, and therefore I try to use the Japanese word most of the time, kounenki, because it doesn't really translate. The Japanese language, as you know, is very, very sensitive to minor body changes and makes all sorts of distinctions that we can't make in English. And when the people who were helping me with the with translating this questionnaire, when we were talking about this, they would laugh and they would say, "Oh, you know, you English speakers, you're so dull about your bodies. You just don't have the right language to talk about it at all." And so we had to put in all sorts of words to do with feeling a sense of heaviness in the head, or feeling that you're languid in your body.
I think this is a really important point on something that I think Western images and understandings of Japan haven't caught up with yet. There are stereotypes about Japanese senses of spirituality.
Right.
But the way these are linked in with senses of the body.
Exactly.
What got you interested in the topic? I mean, aside from what I think gets all of us interested in studying middle age, and that's
because you become middle-aged, unfortunately.
It matters to you.
Happens to all of us. I think perhaps I came at it from a different angle from you in the first place, because I have spent all my teaching career working in a medical school as well as in an anthropology department. And this means that I've become very close to the medical profession and the kinds of thinking that they bring to the different stages of the life cycle. And of course, one of the things that's characteristic of the life cycle in modern society is that it has become, we say, medicalized. It's the assumption is that one can't be born and one can't grow up and one can't grow old without the help of the medical profession, and that they have to help your body through all these different stages of the life cycle. This, of course, is something that's very new. It's part of modern society. And I was particularly interested in the way in which this was being done very differently, as is so often the case in Japan and in North America. And as a medical anthropologist, of course, I'm naturally interested in the body. That's what I see my profession to be, and particularly the cultural construction of the body and the way in which it's understood and interpreted and talked about and actually experienced differently in different cultures. And the middle part of the life cycle, as you pointed out, is a stage which is not very well covered. It's in fact the last part of the life cycle to have been discovered.
Much more on old age, even now yet, although people are beginning to focus on middle age.
But we didn't even discover old age until relatively recently. It was only at the end of the last century that people really started to think about the life cycle from an academic point of view and to carve it up into different periods of time. But middle age got lost in all those. After you got married, that was it. You suddenly became old, and nobody really analyzed what happened in that long middle period.
Yeah, well, you know, what I remember from what I could find about 20 years ago in the literature on middle age, it tended to say in one paragraph, well, we all know what goes on there. There's no need to study it.
Yes.
And what I ran into, interviewing middle-aged Japanese women, and questions about menopause came up, and the general reaction I got was, so what?
Yes.
So it happens. Of course it happens.
Yeah.
And then I had to contrast that with what I found in the academic literature in the West on menopause, which said this is a terrible problem, and it just didn't square. So, so what have you found then?
Well, I found that that is still what holds very much. There are two processes that are going on. There's the process of biological aging, and then there are the social transitions through the different stages of the life cycle. And still in Japan, at least in terms of middle age and particularly this part of the life cycle for women, the emphasis is still much more on the social transition, and the biological transition is not one that is taken to be so important. I mean, people pay attention to it and they notice it, but they largely interpret it in terms of what it means for them as a social being and as part of the family. And they see it as a natural part of the life cycle, an inevitable part of the aging process, and something which one just has to accept. But they don't greet it with tremendous fear, and they don't have a sense that their bodies are going to start falling apart instantly the moment that they've gone through menopause. Whereas in the West, it is, especially in recent years, over the past 25 years particularly, and with increasing frequency, it's become more and more medicalized and thought of more and more as a kind of pathological part of the life cycle. So in fact, menopause is actually talked about and written about in medical literature as a deficiency disease, and it's likened to diabetes and the need to take insulin, or to thyroid deficiency.
Hormonal deficiency?
That's right. It's called a hormone, it's estrogen deficiency, and it's called a deficiency disease. And so the focus, because many women in North America are interested in maintaining their health, looking after their bodies and so on, and a lot has now been written in the popular literature and so on. The focus has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to the biological changes and the impact on the body. And people have tended to ignore the social context in which the aging process happens.
I wanted to ask then about how the study evolved. You know, how you decided to go to get these various kinds of data and bring them together.
It started really because I have two colleagues in North America who had been working in this area for some time. One of them is Pat Colford, who is at the University of Manitoba, and she's a sociologist. And she had already done a lot of work in menopause in Canada. And another colleague who is actually a biostatistician, Sonia McKinley, who lives in Massachusetts. And Sonia had been doing work with 8,000 women in Massachusetts because she's a biostatistician. And Pat had been doing quantitative research like Sonia in Manitoba with 2,500 Manitoban women. And I had been listening to some of their results and was interested in this. And what I realized very quickly from a glance through the anthropological literature was that there had been virtually no research that had been done on the menopause in cross-cultural settings, and nothing that had been done with a large sample of women.
One study in Israel, as I recall, about 20 years ago, and it was the only thing that I ran across at that time.
Right.
There's more now.
That's right. That's right. So almost nothing. The other thing that was special about all of these studies is that most of the work that has been done on menopause in the West has been done with clinical samples. It's been done with women who are going to the doctor, and therefore there's a high proportion of those women who have had surgical treatments or have special problems. And almost no research had been done with the ordinary population, even in the West. So we really don't know what the experience is like for ordinary women. So this is partly what Pat and Sonia had set out to do with their quantitative studies. Their studies are very fine, very nicely controlled, and are comparable with each other. They use the same questionnaire. And so I talked to them, and we decided that I would try and use the same questionnaire in Japan. Now, of course, this had to be modified enormously. And I brought the questionnaire to Japan, and
often some of the most important things you learn are what you learn going through that process of modifying,
of translating and changing the questions and so on. And of course, I had already had experience in Japan with doing research into health and health-connected things, and so I had a sense that we would need some radical changes to this questionnaire. And obvious changes are to do with the structure of the medical system is different, and so those kinds of questions had to be changed. The structure of the family is different, so those kinds of questions had to be changed. Obviously, one didn't need to ask which ethnic group do you belong to and those kinds of things. Or
not many options.
We were careful not to. Well, and we were
yeah.
careful to have only Japanese in the sample. But the most important changes had to be made to the symptom list. And the symptom list in the West is about 20 items, which covers symptoms which are thought to be, have traditionally thought by some people to be associated with menopause. But in addition, other ordinary symptoms are inserted into the list so that women are not, they don't know that this questionnaire is designed, at the first part of the questionnaire, they don't know that it's designed to elicit symptoms in connection with menopause, because the idea is to not get them into giving you stereotyped answers.
Sure.
So there's things like, have you had a cold, or have you had stomach problems and things like this. So ordinary symptoms are integrated into these ones that are thought to be associated with the menopause. This, I think it was originally a 21 or a 24 item list, is in Japan it's a 52 item list. And sure enough, when we did the questionnaire and we did all the careful translation and tried a preliminary run, did a back translation, and then finally translated all these questionnaires, and I handed them out to 1,300 Japanese women. The response to the experience of hot flash was extremely low. Yeah. And it is significantly different from the results in Massachusetts and Manitoba. And so are the responses for night sweats, which is the other typical symptom in the West, extremely low in Japan. And when it comes to emotional states, Japanese women are concerned about becoming irritable and losing control of their sense of being in a good, balanced mood. But they're not that worried about depression. That isn't something which is associated with menopause. You
had a team of people who were helping you. Let's talk a little bit about them. Who are some of these people? How did you get together with them?
Well, these are all women who live in Kobe, as a matter of fact. I met them through a friend of mine who is actually an American woman, but she's married to a Japanese and has lived in Japan for 20 years. Not all of them knew each other for many years, because this is Kobe, and so many of these people have come from other parts of the country and have moved in, and they've welcomed them into their group. So that's also something different from the Japan that we think about. We think it's hard to make new friends and so on, and that hasn't been the case with this group. Anyway, they decided they were very interested in the question of women's health. They were very interested in what I was doing, and so they agreed that I could pay them. Then this group of women became the coders. Once we'd got the questionnaire all done and everybody
had checked, they did
all the tabulation. And then finally I took everything along to Kyoto University, and Kyoto, this was in 1984, Kyoto University entered it onto the key card, the punch cards, which we still had to use in those days. And I had a whole box of these cards, which I then had to mail to the big computer in Manitoba. And at the other end, when it arrived in Manitoba, they were absolutely panicked that someone would drop the box and they would lose the order of all these cards before they'd got them entered into the computer over there, you know. But it worked, and the computer languages spoke to each other, and it was really very, very exciting. And these ladies did an incredible job. All the statisticians and quantitative people who've seen these questionnaires say this is some of the cleanest data that they have ever seen, and it's because of these women.
20 years ago, when I was doing these interviews with middle-aged, both women and men, in Japan, I didn't detect that there was much medicalization of menopause at that time, but you seem to have found a lot of it in recent years.
In Japan? No, there isn't a lot of medicalization. There is a little. The Japanese doctors actually invented the current word which is used for menopause in Japanese, which is koonenki. They invented that at the beginning of this century. as a result of having gone to Germany and having talked to German doctors about many things, and in the conversation with German doctors, they talked about this thing called the climacterium, which the Germans were talking about, and the Japanese doctors obviously were interested and influenced by this. And they came back to Japan and started writing in their medical professional journals articles which reflected the influence of the German thinking on them. And with particular emphasis on the autonomic nervous system, which was central to German medicine of the time, and which fitted very nicely with the Japanese doctors' ideas of thinking about the body in a kind of holistic way, thinking about the way in which all the different parts of the body are interrelated. Since that time, there really has been, it's only been an interest for a very, very small number of doctors until recently. And what has happened recently in Japan is that and I'm sure you're aware of this, that gynecologists and obstetricians in Japan make a very large amount of their income from two different sources, or they have done until recently. One is doing abortions, of which there are a very large number, and the other is delivering babies. So until recently, that's been the way in which most doctors, most gynecologists have made their income.
But the birth rate is...
But the birth rate, as we all know, is descending rather rapidly.
1.53 statistical children per...
Causing a lot of panic. In addition, many women want to have their babies in tertiary care hospitals and not in the private clinics of individual gynecologists. So they lost that practice, or a large amount of that practice. Furthermore, people are now using contraception a little better, and so there are fewer abortions. So to cut a fascinating, rather sordid story short, there are some gynecologists who are actually looking for medical work. Some of them have turned to menopause, and they're very explicit about this. When I talk to them, they're quite frank about this, that they feel that this is a stage of the life cycle which has not received much medical attention, and they now have the time to do that. But still, most of the gynecologists that I've talked to are very ambivalent, because they believe that a very larger part of this care should be counselling, and should be talking about the family and the family situation, and should be dealing with the question of what the 50-year-old woman is going to do with the rest of her life, and those kinds of things. And they're very frank. They don't feel that they have the skills to do that. That's right. And they also, most of them, are really rather ambivalent about handing out what they see as very, very strong medication. And they don't see it as necessary because they don't conceptualize the biological transition as a disease or as a deficiency disease. They still conceptualize it as a natural life cycle transition. And they focus a lot still on the autonomic nervous system, and they believe that it is a period of time, maybe of a few years, where there may be a few ups and downs in physical symptoms, but that once you're through that, then there's really nothing very much to be concerned about. So even those gynecologists who, and there are a very large number of them, who go to international conferences, and of course they read all the literature in English, they're still very, very skeptical about what is happening in North America particularly, and in Europe, and they haven't followed suit.
Do you see a message then that you can carry back from these doctors to the medical profession in North America in this regard?
Yes, that's part of what I see my function to be so far, because the Japanese doctors themselves are not doing that yet. They're at the point where they're still groping around a little. They sense that the Western data doesn't fit with what they see and what they understand and what they experience with their patients. The Japanese doctors are sensitive to the fact that there's something different going on. But so far, they feel they're not prepared to go and make public statements about this, because they want to do scientific research before they go and do that. And they're just now mobilizing themselves to do that. Up till now, it's mostly been me that's been running back to conferences in North America and in Europe and talking about this, and trying to get the doctors over there to think in a much broader terms, because they, of course, assume that they're dealing with a universal phenomenon about which what they say is applicable to anybody, anywhere. And this is one of my very basic concerns, is to break down the notion that there is something universal to menopause.
What's been the reaction then of Western medical people when you carry this message?
Some are very excited and very interested, but the majority of those who are very involved in dealing with the menopause are extremely unhappy because it threatens what is central to their worldview. And it threatens, if one wants to put it in a crass way, it sort of threatens their livelihood because they're now making a lot of research and getting a lot of money being paid to do the kind of studies which they do, which are based on the assumption that they're dealing with something which is universally unvariable. And
but you know, in the book, you've been very careful to document your points extensively.
yes, oh yes, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it puts them in a difficult position to argue against very extensive evidence of many kinds that you brought together in the book.
Yes, it does, although it's easy to ignore it. You know, if one doesn't want to hear, one just acts as though it's not there, and this is what tends to happen a bit at the moment.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask then about what are the taboo topics or the difficult topics? Or are there any that you found for middle-aged women to talk about being middle-aged in Japan?
I think in the right situation, there are almost, as far as I can understand, there are almost no taboo topics. Particularly if one's sitting with a group of women, all of whom are about the same age.
Of course, I think anthropologists have found not only in Japan, but probably in most societies that it's money that's the real taboo topic, not sex or
yes.
health, are the things that they find easier to talk about and less easy to talk about. But about being middle-aged and female.
Well, the natural inclination is to talk about the children and what the children are doing, provided that they're doing all right.
What about with mother-in-law?
Well, that's the other topic which can be very difficult. The one reason why it can be very difficult is because when you're talking to people in their house, mother-in-law is often in the next room, and everybody knows she's listening. And so obviously you're not going to talk about her. But she's a burden because she's often had illness and she's at home and has to be looked after. And so I met many women who had barely been out of the house for 10 or 11 years, looking after bedridden elderly mother-in-law. And if she's senile as well, then it really is a tremendous burden. I think it's much the hardest burden that middle-aged women have to deal with. And I think so far they have very little support. And I believe that this is perhaps the issue that is going to mobilize Japanese women more than any other issue.
I've wondered about that for some time.
There is some mobilization among middle-aged women themselves to try and deal with this problem. And it's a fascinating problem, and I think it really may be the source of some major transformations in Japanese society. There is, for example, a group that started out in Osaka of middle-aged housewives who so far did not have to look after their own elderly, but who were not part of the workforce. They're middle-class women who had nothing more to do. Their children had left home. And they decided that what they would do would be to volunteer to help with the elderly in other people's homes. And this really is a major transformation, as you know, because entering into other people's houses is a big step. But the need of the people who are looking after the elderly is such that they're willing to do this. From my point of view as an anthropologist, one of the most important transformations is that it does mean that, that the family is now opened up and that people can come and go into the family. It's no longer this very private domain where you don't really know what's happening some of the time. Yeah.
But by contrast, my impression is that middle-aged women have not been able to politically mobilize very effectively yet.
Yes, that's true. That's true. There have been some efforts, and there is a series of ongoing symposia which is run by several, I suppose they would describe themselves as feminists. They're not radical feminists, they're concerned feminists, middle-aged women who are concerned about the status of women in Japanese society. And they now run an annual symposium which deals with the aging society and particularly with its impact on middle-aged women. So through that forum, they're gradually getting women somewhat politicized. But I still think that the women who are now 50 years old are still, most of them, not prepared to become political. They don't feel it's appropriate, and they would rather live through whatever they have to live through. And it's a matter mostly of trying to work out your own individual situation and be as flexible as you can and try and get a sister-in-law to help or something like that, and to sort of muddle through this difficult time. So I think still, for this present generation of 50-year-olds, on the whole, they're not politicized. But maybe the next generation, I know that some of the people who are now in their 40s feel strongly that they will be much more politicized about this matter.
What's ahead for Margaret Lock? You know, the study on middle age is more or less done. It doesn't mean you won't continue interest in the topic, but
right.
And is the next topic over the horizon yet, or is this
yes,
one of those periods? Oh, it is.
Yes,
you don't
I'm
need
afraid
to
it's a little.
sort of rest and
no,
think
I'm
about
afraid
it for a while.
it's well over the horizon, and I had hoped to finish the middle-age topic a little sooner, because this other one is galloping along, and it's going much faster than I can keep up with it. The situation now is that there has been ongoing for the last 4 or 5 years a national debate about what is death, and a regular polling of the country. Well,
high-level blue ribbon commissions appointed to study.
That's right. And the bottom line is that it's still not possible to do heart and liver and lung transplants in Japan. And it's fascinating because the focus of the argument has been on the dying person and not on the recipient. Most of the concern is about what is death and how do you define death, and the issue of the donation of organs and who the organs belong to, and so on. And I believe very strongly that there are some very, very profound and interesting cultural differences. Clearly there are. Much of this argument is made in terms of science and the way in which you actually measure death, or else it's made in terms of can you really trust doctors? But I think that it is a much deeper and more profound argument than that, and attitudes towards cutting up the body and to who a dead body belongs to, and the question of the ancestors, and the fact that when the physical body is dead, that in some ways you don't actually die, the social being does not die in Japan. And I think that this kind of cultural belief is still an extremely powerful one.
Margaret, it's nice talking to you.
Thank you, that was great fun.